Welcome to the 9th Goodman Lecture presented by Kensei Foundation. I'm Trent Walker, member of the Kensei Foundation Academic Development Committee, as well as a postdoc at the Ho Center for Buddhist Studies at Stanford University. And as you know, today's lecture features a lecture by Professor Eviatar Shulman on creating the early discourses of the Buddha. And I'll say a little bit more about our speaker in just a minute. Most of you are probably already familiar with Kensei Foundation and the Goodman Lectures. In case you aren't, I encourage you to check out www.kenseifoundation.org to learn more about the organization, its founder, Dzongsar Khyentse Rinpoche, the diverse kinds of projects we partner with across the world, as well as the vision for this particular lecture series in honor of Professor Stephen Goodman. As always, we'll have a period of discussion after Professor Shulman's talk. And as I mentioned before, to ask a question, please submit it to KF Q&A in the chat box, and I'll pose selected questions directly to our speaker. So really looking forward to that portion of the event today. Kensei Foundation, as you know, has the pleasure of partnering with Buddhist studies programs and universities all across the world, in Asia, Europe, North America, and beyond. And our partnership with the Hebrew University of Jerusalem is actually our first in West Asia. Through Professor Shulman's dynamic vision and advocacy on behalf of Buddhist studies at that university, coupled with Dzongsar Khyentse Rinpoche's transformative visit to the university in 2018, Kensei Foundation is delighted to be able to sponsor a permanent position in Tibetan Buddhist studies there, namely the Khyentse Professor in Buddhist Studies, which was filled this past fall by Ian McCormack, now a lecturer in the Department of Comparative Religion and Asian Studies. Kensei Foundation is also very fortunate to have the chance to support graduate students in Buddhist studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, as well as other forms of Buddhist studies programming, including international conferences. Indeed, some elements of the book connected to Professor Shulman's talk today were first delivered at a conference he organized there in December 2019 on the idea of text in Buddhism. And so today we're very lucky to have Professor Shulman with us for this event, especially as his latest book, Visions of the Buddha, Creative Dimensions of Early Buddhist Scripture, was just released late this past year. Professor Shulman, for those who don't know, is one of the most innovative scholars of Buddhist texts in the field. And it's really his energetic new approach to Pali texts that has really begun to transform our understanding of the earliest layers of the Buddhist tradition. Professor Shulman was trained at the same institution where he now teaches after periods of teaching elsewhere in Israel. His dissertation, The Fullness of Emptiness, dealt with the seminal 2nd century Buddhist thinker Nagarjuna. And it's this engagement that resulted in several articles on Nagarjuna's thought, as well as a complete Hebrew translation of Nagarjuna's most famous work in Sanskrit, the Mula Madhyamaka Garika. Professor Shulman has since, in his scholarship, turned towards Buddhist texts preserved in Pali, the sacred language of the Theravada tradition. One aspect of this new direction in his work has focused on what were perhaps the oldest Buddhist poems, namely parts of the Sutta Nipata, the Parayana Vagga, and the Atthaka Vagga, a subject on which he has published several widely cited articles. At the same time, his work has also illuminated core aspects of the oldest layers of the Buddhist philosophical tradition. And it's through his 2014 book, Rethinking the Buddha, Early Buddhist Philosophy as Meditative Perception, that offered a bold new take on the Four Noble Truths, on dependent origination, on the doctrine of anatta, or non-self or selflessness, arguing that these philosophical concepts originated not as general teachings, but rather specific insights to be cultivated in advanced stages of meditation. And indeed, it's this capacity of Professor Shulman to overturn previously established views in the field that's very much displayed in the latest phase of his work, which I understand he'll be sharing with us more about today. And it's in this phase that he has begun to illuminate the literary world of Pali scriptures, often in quite unexpected ways. His articles on the nature of protective chants and cosmology and on sophisticated literary devices in Pali texts are part of this exploration, but his most recent work has offered new angles on the formulaic nature of Buddhist scriptures, particularly through a concept he calls the play of formulas, or the creative and performative ways that early Buddhists brought together the elemental building blocks of Buddhist scripture in new ways. And so for a brilliant one-chapter exposition of some of these ideas, I highly recommend his contribution to this book, The Language of the Sutras, Essays in Honor of Luis Gomez, edited by Natalie Gummer. And his essay there entitled Orality and Creativity in Early Buddhist Discourses, Stock Formulas as an Aspect of Oral Textual Culture in Early Buddhism. While it has a very long title, is a very readable and compelling essay. And in fact, I really recommend this whole volume, which really offers a quite compelling set of essays and perspectives. The fullest statement of Professor Shulman's re-envisioning of how Buddhist scriptures came to be, however, really comes in the form of his latest work, Visions of the Buddha, that I mentioned just before. And for me, it's really by far the most human-centered and emotionally astute account of these texts that I've ever read. And if we're able to, I think, set aside for a moment the intellectual wizardry and grasp of the field of Professor Shulman's scholarship, it's really this capacity to see the past and religious texts in human terms, to feel deeply the creative possibilities that early Buddhists themselves cultivated, that perhaps impresses me most about Professor Shulman's scholarship. And for that reason, I really trust that all of us here are in for a treat with his lecture today. So without further ado, I'd like you all to please join me in welcoming Professor Shulman. Thank you so much for being here with us today. The floor is yours.
Wow. Thanks, Trent, for this incredibly generous and moving introduction. Wow, you kind of left me without words, and thanks so much to the Khyentse Foundation. I feel honored and privileged to be here. And I mean, there's a big thanks to Khyentse Foundation. Trent mentioned the great efforts on behalf of Buddhist studies at the Hebrew University. But there are great efforts worldwide, and especially the ones in academia, I think, are so important, making the connection between the academic world and the kind of broader Sangha. And you called, I think, Rinpoche's visit to Jerusalem transformative, and I think that's true, and it goes along those lines, and I think we'll be reaping the benefits of his vision for a long way down the road. But there are a lot of people at the foundation that have been incredibly generous and helpful, and I guess I won't mention the names, but all of you know who I mean. So once again, I'm very happy to be here and happy to have this opportunity to share these understandings, or my understandings of you could say, about the Dhamma, about what the Dharma, what it's about what it was at the beginning, about what we kind of want it to be and what it is, and maybe if we kind of pause from our immediate impulses, we pick up some of the deeper currents and take them in. And I think this is something that's happening. I mean, you know, we've kind of taken in Buddhism from our own world, from our own historical consciousness, being in the West mainly. I mean, most of us, I guess, and you know, and say the influence of science and materialism and different kinds of philosophies and ideologies that we think through and we don't even know. Like there's always the big question, is Buddhism a religion or not, right? Is it just a way of life? Is it just a philosophy? And certainly in Israel, that's a big question about religion. I'm not sure it's all that, troubles people all that much in other contexts, but yeah, so right, I want to talk to you about the suttas, the early suttas. I'm talking only about the Pali tradition here, but of course these texts exist in other languages too, in other versions. This is a point I'll discuss. But I'm going to be talking about the Pali tradition because that's the one I really know and read. And then, so I mean, the question I'm trying to address is what are these texts? What are they? What are they trying to teach? What are they trying to do? And it is indeed true. I mean, that we should be looking at the human element behind the text. You know, scholarship wants to flatten out the text into this kind of two-dimensional model and say that text originated there and moved there, and then it's as if it's like there's like some clear historical procession. Scholarship cherishes sequence and history and conditionality, much like Buddhism. But then conditionality involves the human, involves what people do with things and what they feel. And it involves their excitement and their vision and their love and care, and for each other or for the Buddha in this case is very important. And their philosophy, their understanding, the meditative practice. There's many different worlds, right? I'll be showing a couple pictures in my PowerPoint. As you can see, actually, I would say, I'm kind of deliberating between an oral presentation and a kind of written presentation, which would be my PowerPoint, which I'll soon share. But I thought this would be a good way to open. Because this is a question in a sense about the text. The text, like if we want to say, we want to know what the Buddha really taught, okay? Say we've gone to some retreat and we've been really moved by some presentation of, say, non-duality, okay? Non-duality is not a big concept in the early discourses, but we feel it like gets to the heart of the Buddha, and our experience tells us this is like what the whole thing is about. So then, you know, we could debate that, or other things like, say, a Pure Land Buddhism, right? Which seems very far removed from the world of early Buddhism. And then there's all these different traditions in Buddhism. And we want to say, okay, let's stop for a minute. Let's see what the Buddha really taught. How are we going to figure that out? So we can ask our teachers or different, you know, teachers we respect in the Buddhist world or friends, or normally though, we want to go to the texts. We want the text to tell us what the Buddha really said and what he really meant. But these are oral texts. So these texts lived for hundreds of years before they were written. They were composed in people's minds and voices. They were shared in contexts in which the kind of reverberation of sound within the body was maybe more important than the conceptual meaning. That still happens today, like in the Parita context, and chanting in the Theravada world, protective chanting. Most people, even the monks who recite the text, don't always know what they mean, because nobody knows Pali, so they can consult translations. I mean, that's just an example. And but we know. I mean, we know. What do we know? Of course, we don't really know anything. We don't even know. Who we really are. But as far as we know history, these texts lived orally for a few hundred years. So maybe the better way to kind of feel them would just be to talk about it in this kind of oral style, rather than me moving us to the cognitive mode, the analytical mode. So, soon I'll be putting my arguments up on the board, and we'll have a few pictures that will move us and, take us here and there. And I'll tell you a few stories, but maybe better to go the oral way. This is kind of, I'm opening in this way. So we open ourselves to this kind of different, experiential mode, call it cognitive mode, where words are up there in the air and people are doing different things with them, and they're telling stories, and they're practicing meditation, and they're practicing sila, morality, and they're studying philosophy and texts, and they're telling stories, and they want to have some fun. They want to have funny stories sometimes, and they want to have moving stories, like to say something about the stories about the Buddha's death, the Mahaparinibbana Sutta. It's a very emotional story. Nobody really cares if the Buddha went from which town he went from to which other town, and what he really taught there or not. But going from place to place and saying goodbye, seeing it for the last time, seeing is a very powerful element in any Indian religion, darshan. Seeing the Buddha would be a transformative moment for anyone. That's the world of these Pali texts, in which the Buddha is not just a teacher, he's a holy substance. The very fact that a realized being for these people walked the face of the earth is the most important fact about history. And it says something about history. It turns history inside out. History is not about history. It's not about the facts. It's about the potentials and the capacities and the consciousness. Because if theoretically we could become the Buddha in 100 billion years, that says something quite different about us than being these animals who are just kind of, fighting for survival and adapting to the environment. I'm kind of enjoying the oral mode, but I think I'm going to move on to my PowerPoint. I think it's about time. But what I was saying so far, okay, is basically two things. One is the oral mode. Is one of the things I want to talk about is what was orality in early Buddhism? What did it look like? Okay. And let me just say something, that it's not just about having fun. It's not just about, sharing, having these moving emotional experiences. A lot of it is about very carefully phrased moments of text, passages. Like, you all know this. Eva me suttam, thus have I heard, ekam samayam, Bhagavan. One time the Bhagavan was in Savatthi at Jeta Grove at Anathapindika's park. And there he said to the monks, this is like, we kind of passed through this because we've read it 1,000 times. This is really important. The very fact that the Bhagavan, the Buddha, was there. And so these fixed passages, right? It's not just a free floating orality where like the bard, the improviser, the performer is just doing what he feels like on that day. It's a very careful, very analytical literature. Okay, so I want to try to kind of speak about orality, and I've introduced this concept in order for you to kind of think about it, have it in your mind while I'm talking, because maybe what I say isn't all that important. There's like a question: what is this oral nature of the early tradition in this particular case? Orality is a big theme in many, right, in many disciplines. But in the Buddhist case, it has a particular manifestation. Okay, so that's one thing I said. And I thought there was another, but I don't remember. That's the prices you pay for orality. But it will come back in a moment. It's up there in the PowerPoint. And certainly there was something about the Buddha and the importance of the Buddha, but that wasn't number two. Okay, so pardon me for this imperfect oral performance, for ending it in this way. Okay. Right. Okay. So Trent, can you just confirm that we see this okay?
We see it. It's not yet in the perfect. It's wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, so we may have to rely more on the oral mode because like every statement here is like appears at its time. Okay, so I want to talk about the way the texts were created. I mean, that's what I thought I would say. And I used the picture from the invitation to say, look at the picture here. Actually, it's funny, there's a mistake in the statue, right? Because he should be doing a Dhammacakkappavattana mudra because, right, it looks like he's teaching. He's not the Bhumi Sparsha, right? But so let's say the Buddha's teaching here, and we're actually trying to access the Buddha's teaching through the text. Okay, let's say that would characterize the like maybe the main way we approach these texts. We want to see what the great teacher actually said. Okay, so then we read these discourses, and of course, there's also Vinaya and Abhidhamma, and I don't want to talk about that today. Let's just say all we have is the discourses, okay? So what do we have? All these records which present themselves as if these are records, historical records of the Buddha's teachings, okay? As if the Buddha was at a certain place, somebody came and talked to him, and this is what he said, okay? But what I'm going to say is that that's just pretending. This will emerge like later in the talk, there may be a way actually to access real historical, I don't know, facts, but processes through these materials. But it's not about the details. The stories aren't true, and they're usually not trying to be true. There may be certain discourses that are based on real historical incidences. I'm not trying to deny that. But I'm not saying the Buddha didn't teach the doctrines that are found in the Nikayas, in the Sutta Pitaka. I'm not saying that, but it's not as it appears, okay? So then there's the question, will it take us back to the Buddha? And let's just kind of see what tradition is telling us about these texts. So tradition, this is a Theravada tradition, right? Which has preserved these texts, maybe even created them as in the way we know them. That there was they call it a council or a sangiti, a recitation, a joint recitation. Not long, maybe 3 months after the Buddha's death. Because Mahakassapa was like the leading monk then, and he realized that things are going to get really messy if they don't establish a real canonical corpus. And like they always, in the text, they're always like kind of poking at the Jains who haven't done that, and then they're just fighting with each other all day. They like to poke at the Jains, I think, because they're the early Buddhist main rivals. So the Buddha just died, and as I said, that's a very, very emotionally potent, pregnant moment. People are very, very sad. And when Ananda, the Buddha's attendant, goes from place to place on his way to Rajagaha, where the assembly is going to take place, the council, people say, they meet him and they're crying. We used to come here with the Buddha, and now you come alone. And Ananda is not yet enlightened. Lucky for us, he gets enlightened on the night before this council is going to take place, and supposedly, right? So we have Ananda as one of the key figures here, and there are 500 arahants. So arahants, what does that mean for us? And the trust we have in the textual tradition, supposedly, is 500 people who have no personal interest, who have put the text together. No ego, no personal desire, no need for any enjoyment or other. So it's a very, very faithful account. And Ananda has this perfect memory, and he was the Buddha's attendant, so he witnessed all these events, and then the tradition records them and classifies the text into the longer ones, the Digha Nikaya ones, the middle length ones, and then there are other kinds, the Majjhima, Samyutta and Anguttara. And I'll forget about it. If anybody knows what the Khuddaka Nikaya is, we'll talk about that another day. So there are 4 collections, and they're entrusted to the 4 of the Buddha's most senior disciples, and they establish what's called the Bhānaka tradition, what scholarship likes to call the Bhānaka system. These are professional reciters that kept the text faithfully until this day. Now, okay, so basically for tradition, what we get in the text is the words of the Buddha. And what we can say about this, I mean, scholarship has been quite skeptical of this account, rightfully so. I'll say something about this in a minute. But basically, what they tell us, I mean, this is like a kind of established fact in Buddhist studies, which probably should be looked into more carefully, because it's based on only like these 2 verses in certain kind of historiographical text. But the texts were written a few hundred years after the Buddha died in Sri Lanka. And then within the context of the Mahavihara, which is the major, call it, sect in Sri Lanka at the time, under the leadership of Buddha Gosa, the main commentator, and who probably worked with the teams. He were composed the commentaries on the text. And then the commentaries, they comment on the suttas according to a word-by-word format, and then the text can kind of be verified. So scholarships have been quite skeptical. Okay, I don't want to take too long, so I'm not going to mention the names and the different views here. Okay, but like scholars have said, we have no way to verify this account, and what we get is the Mahavihara's need to announce that it holds the one true canon in order to get support in the context of sectarial rivalry in Sri Lanka. We can't take this as a testimony to what really happened in early Buddhism. And scholarship is justified in some of this skepticism, and in other parts it's not. There could be, scholarship is very interested in discrepancies between the texts and contradictions, but contradictions may be a different way of saying things. They need not necessarily be a mistake okay, but one thing that is very important for scholarship today is the fact, and you may have heard Peter Skilling's talk a couple months ago about the different canons about that exist within Buddhism. So take a text like the Satipatthana Sutta on the foundations of mindfulness, which many of you would know. If you take the Chinese versions of this text and the Pali version, then they're very different. They share certain elements, but others diverge. And then the question, what does this mean? So what scholars like to do, what has become like the most popular scholarly approach to this text, which began in the 50s mainly, or actually begun earlier, but like in the 1950s, there were important works that used this method. And Analayo, who many of you may know, a German monk scholar, has done incredible work on these comparative methods. And then you compare, and supposedly where the texts agree, that's what the Buddha really said, or as close as you can get. Okay, and then people who practice this approach and others have become quite optimistic in our ability to know what really happened at the beginning. Okay, so I mentioned the Satipatthana. So we have, what do we do when we have different texts and they give us a different understanding of what the Satipatthana is? But then also, if we want to be serious and look, and there's lots of texts that talk about sati, and they work in different ways, and they're not all saying the same thing. They coalesce at certain points, and they break. Some sati emphasizes the body, some emphasizes the breath. Some emphasizes more conceptual aspect. Some will include jhana and samadhi. Others will not. Why is that? Because the tradition, in my view, okay, is not so fixed as we would like it to be. They're experimenting. They're connecting between sati, right, mindfulness, and other philosophical ideas, other modes of practice, other meditations. And then a text like the Satipatthana is more like a grid in which each tradition can insert its own understanding of the practice. And when we're comparing the versions, we're not getting to any core. At best, we get the grid, and the grid isn't what is important. What is important is the dynamic in which there are different types of practice that early Buddhists, and let's try to, I'm kind of gonna incline today to talk about the meditative world that these texts may introduce us to. I hope we'll have enough time for that. It's also formulaic. You practice this meditation, and then you practice another and another, and you're using these formulas, right? That was the second element, is these fixed elements, these fixed textual elements within the oral sequence, okay? Right? So I thought I'd give an example of how the texts are not just the Buddha's words. And this is like, this is actually material from my first book. You probably, mostly of you have encountered the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the text, the discourse on the setting in motion of the wheel of Dharma. Supposedly the Buddha's first text. So we'll say, okay, we want to know what the Buddha really taught. Let's go there. But this text we can easily see has been reworked naturally, because the tradition is taking this first text as a kind of pamphlet, you know, to kind of sell its ideas. And here, this is something, I guess I won't go into details here. So the text will say this, and this, monks, is the noble truth of suffering, and then give the explanation. And this, monks, is the noble truth of the arising of suffering, or the cessation of suffering. And this, monks, is the noble, is the, what's going on here? And is the noble truth of the path that leads to the cessation of suffering. But what happens here, there was an earlier formula, which was like, call it the real or the original or the earliest formulation of the Four Noble Truths, which just said, I should have put this in English, idam dukkham, this is dukkha, this meaning this present moment, this anything that arises in experience, that I can call it this, and this is a close this that I can point to. And this is the arising of dukkha. And this is the cessation of dukkha, and this is the path that leads to the cessation of dukkha. Now, the funny thing is, and this is the point about the text, okay, what this teaches us about meditation is another question. But about the text, see, this is an argument, I should have written this, that Kenneth Norman, one of the great scholars of the great philologists of the Pali tradition, he showed that the way this is said, if you read the Pali, idam dukkha samudayam or dukkha nirodham arya satcham, this doesn't make sense grammatically. Why doesn't it make sense? Because yes, you can see like this dukkha samudayo down here is a masculine noun. And here it's turned a neuter noun, and then the idam, replaces the ayam, which is, sorry, here this is feminine. That has happened in order to fit the new conception of the noble truth, rather than just looking at these elements. This is suffering. This is the arising of suffering. We are now being presented with a kind of official doctrine of the Four Noble Truths, a mature presentation. And it doesn't, I go into more detail here, it doesn't really make sense if it would really translate what it says. So it would be, this is the truth that gives rise to suffering. That would be the statement on the second noble truth. Now, of course, this can kind of be debated to some degree. I don't want to go into that, but I'm just trying to give you the feel that what we find in the text has been reworked by different layers of the tradition. Okay. All right. Now, I've talked about orality, and let's kind of go into that world. And you can enjoy the picture while I'm talking. This is the Buddha. Actually, he's about to perform a great miracle and rise into the sky. You can see the fire. He's rising into the sky here. And you can see he's supposed to be emitting, it's just fire that he's emitting from his body. And I don't know if I probably want to move the zoom box, because what's going on the right side is very important. If you see this naked ascetic here, who's being pulled with this is when they're pulling him with ropes, but they can't take him away from his seat. And it's a very funny episode. They're saying to him, what's going on? Is your butt stuck to the chair? Is a chair stuck to your butt? And he's saying, I'm coming. And he's wriggling, but he can't get out. And actually, this is not what it says in the Pali text, because, this is a picture from Gandhara where you have a different kind of representation of this episode where they're trying to pull him in with ropes. But in the Pali, they don't pull him in with ropes. Buddha only says they would. Okay. And this is saying that there are different versions of the story. Okay. This is just a kind of comical example. It's a very funny story. Okay. The text as we have it, may have been recited by monks at some point, but it was probably a story that was staged or at least, told in kind of different events. And it was at least to get the monks, and probably not only monks, to have a good laugh. And that's, a classical sutta, number 24, 5 in the Majjhima Nikaya, in the Digha Nikaya, sorry. Okay, so this is the question here. Are we talking about a fixed recitation or a performance? And I mentioned this kind of earlier shortly. But the view has been very popular in Buddhist studies that the texts were meant mainly for fixed recitation. And I don't want to deny that, but I'm not the only scholar that has been emphasizing the performative aspects of the text over recently. There's a bunch of recent works. And I'm not saying the texts are base for a performance or a record of performance, but I do think they corresponded with such performances in certain cases, okay? And then there's a question about the languages. As I said, what happens when we have one satipatthana, or take this text, the Patika Sutta, this same episode with the rope is different in any text, in any version you look at. Why is that? Because each tradition is telling the story the way it likes it. Why is the Satipatthana different? Because each philosopher is putting the Satipatthana, the establishing of mindfulness teaching, according to the way he wants to teach it. So what are we going to get from the comparison between the versions? What we're going to get is just versions. We're going to get particular visions. They don't necessarily need to compare. We can look at the Chinese tradition as a whole, or strands within it. We can look at the Pali tradition or strands within it and get pictures of the way these people understood the Dhamma, understood the Buddhist world, understood the external world too. Okay. The point is that in any case, without having to decide if this is about a performance or not, there's a very powerful creative element here. And this creative element is meant to move people, to cause them to have aesthetic experiences, to cause them to love the Buddha and care for him and sense his presence. And sometimes they're also aimed to have fun and to entertain. If you look at Vinaya stories, they're pretty funny and actually pretty sexual too. And I mentioned this at the beginning. Behind all this, there's a very deep metaphysic. We often like to think of the Buddhist tradition as being steering away from metaphysics, but no. No, the fact that, as I said, that the Buddha walked the earth is a very important philosophical idea, that he was a Buddha. What I think is that generally what we find here is more like literary tellings, and that they correspond with performances in different ways. And yeah, I'm not going to get into very great detail. There's a strong traditional element. There's repetition of these fixed elements, but there's also a creative element alive in the way they're applied in each particular context. So again, I mentioned the Mahaparinibbana Sutta. So if you take the artistic vision here, I mean, which one of these pictures is telling us what really happened when the Buddha died? Now, they're all giving us an image of the Buddha, right? He's lying down between the two trees that are blossoming out of season. Flowers are falling from the sky. The gods are pouring showers of flowers. They're all coming there. All these are gods. If you take this modern kind of a cognitive approach, right, which you get the details better, then these are all gods, and they're below them there are monks. These gods also are incredibly distressed. And then this is like Japanese. So each, just like here, right? And I said, it's a very moving story. It's an emotional story. It's not about the historical facts. Some historical facts may be there. Okay, I'm not trying to say that they didn't have any sense of history, but it's not what they cared about. Right, and this is just an aside. I'm not going to say anything here, but just to say that monks chanting, even fixed text, also has a performative dimensions and a strong aesthetic effect, and a strong emotional presence and different kind of things we could talk about. Okay, but now I'm going to kind of go into my argument in a more specific way, just a bit, not very intensely. I don't want to try your patience too much. And as Trent mentioned, showed you the book. So here it is, Visions of the Buddha, creative dimensions of early Buddhist scripture. So that's the point, that to the text, they have this strong creative element within them. They're not trying to preserve the Buddha's teachings, although in certain cases they may, but that's not like their main goal, okay? And my favorite example has been for years, what happens when the Buddha goes to meet a paribhajaka teacher. This is like a rival renunciate. So he'll wake up very early in the morning, and after his meditation, he'll see that it's too early to go to town for alms. So then he'll say, why don't I go meet that teacher who's staying in that park? And he heads out there. Now, the thing about these paribhajakas is that they don't know anything about what, true practice is. You need to be the Buddhist student for that, certainly in the Pali world, in the Buddhist world in general. These guys, they sit there and they're talking, and they're like animals. They're yelling and they're talking about the army, and they're in politics and the king, and about thieves and all stuff in the news, and about women and gossiping and all this stuff, and in loud voices, and they're chattering and whatever. Okay, so then the teacher sees the Buddha, their teacher. There's 500 of them, and they're yelling like that. And the Buddha, their teacher, will see the Buddha coming from afar, and he'll say, shut up, guys, the Buddha's coming. He likes quiet. Maybe if we'll be quiet, he'll think we're worthy of a visit. So they all kind of manage to somehow calm down. And then the Buddha comes closer, and the teacher comes up to greet him and says, welcome, welcome, Swagatam Buddha, Swagatam Bhagava, or no, Bhante, or I don't know how we could remember how he calls him exactly there, but it's a term of respect. And he says, and he welcomes in it and says, it's been so long since you visit us. Here, please sit down on this prepared seat, meaning his own seat, the higher seat. And he himself goes and takes a lower seat and sits down to the side, okay? Now this story, call it, repeats in many texts, in about a dozen texts, I think, or maybe a bit less, but it's the same formula. that is repeated. And you can take this formula and add other elements to it. You can have one of the Buddhist students or somebody else wanting to come visit the Buddha, figuring out it's too early, and then this can connect. And that's the point about these formulas, is that they're like Lego. You can take them apart and put them back together. And if you take this formula for a meeting with the Paribhajaka, the Buddha will give a teaching about the value of quiet, about his capacity for silence. Okay? So that, just saying that's a pretty long formula. Okay, we could have other formulas. Okay, first of all, for other kind of figures, there's a certain way where a Brahmin householder meets the Buddha. He hears of him in a certain way, and he goes to him, and they want to go meet. They want to go meet the Buddha, and they argue between them if they should go meet him or not. And there's there different kind of paths that the text can take, but they're specific to Brahmin householders, just like that formula about the noisy ascetics is particular to meetings with Paribhajakas, and that's the way the texts work with these formulas. Now, these are narrative formulas. They're not just narrative formulas. If we want to see what who the Buddhists were arguing with, and how they saw the reality or the social reality around them, we can take each one of these formulas and take it as a picture of how what they saw, what they wanted to represent. And in this way, maybe we can get at a certain level of historical reality. But not thinking that when the Buddha went to meet that ascetic teacher or another, that's what exactly happened on that day. Okay? Not only that, we have formulas for doctrine. We have, say, the jhanas, right? The deep meditative states. They're presented normally in a formulaic way, the same formulas. Now, one of the points is that they can be presented in other ways too, and what happens in the conflicting nature of these accounts. Or for selflessness or the Four Noble Truths, they each have their formulas. For selflessness, we have a bunch of formulas. And hopefully I'll have I don't know how I'm doing for time, but hopefully I'll have a moment to say something about that meditative world towards the end of my talk, about the play of formulas in meditation, not only in the creation of the text. So we have formulas for doctrine too. And again, I doubt the Buddha only taught in formulas. Maybe he did impart formulas to some of his disciples, and they used this as methods for meditation. Maybe this was the way the tradition crystallized his words after time. I don't know. I don't know. But again, I think we can take these formulas as kind of crystallized expression of as early a Buddhism as we can look at through the text. And then when we look at very carefully, these, better memorize them, learn them by heart, and recite them. And with time, you kind of maybe pick up on the meaning of what these formulas are about. So the play of formulas means now I'm an author. I got this pool of formulas. I'm going to put my story together in whatever way I feel like it today. Or better, it's not just like how I feel, because I'm probably doing this with another community, with a community of monks, and we feel things together and we have our ideals. But maybe I did bring my own picture of a text to the community, which I got in my meditation or in my walk or somewhere else. And in any case, a text is a combination of formulas. For me, the formulas are the real text of early Buddhism. Okay, so the texts are not trying to provide access to historical instances normally. They may at certain times, and it's not a kantavada here, not one-sided in any way, okay? But they do introduce some of the most important ideals of the early stage of the tradition. Maybe the formulas, they're like key elements in the tradition. And you can see, I don't think that text is more important than experience or different contexts. Like maybe, the most important thing on a monk's day would be when he met someone and he gave him alms, or maybe he had he saw a pretty tree or a bird in the forest, or I don't know what. I don't think the texts are determining all of experience, but they do crystallize very important visions of the tradition. There is a reason why scholars focus on the text. They've overemphasized it. Then we had to give that up a bit, but we got to come back because the texts are the places where the traditions crystallize their vision. Okay, so we can see the general worldview through the formulas. We can see the dynamic. The dynamic is more important than the details. The details are almost chance elements. What you put in the right place in the formula, how it connects, but the dynamic in which there is this kind of formulaic world. We also live by formulas. I mean, look, Trent introduced me in a certain way. I mean, overly generous, and I express my thanks. That's the only way you can start a talk like this. It's a formula, okay? That's the way things go. It doesn't mean it's not sincere, right? But when we meet our friends and say, what's up, how you doing, and all that, it's all formula. You know, if you answer what's up with some kind of, you know, a deep reflection on existence, so people are like, what's going on with you, man, right? No, you have to kind of say, cool, fine, you know, kind of, it's because we're formulaic. We live in the formulas, they fix these emotional patterns or cognitive patterns. And it's in a sense like as if like Buddhism is very much aware of this, working with this dynamic in a pretty much conscious way, it seems. Okay. Okay, this fits. I think it's a very Buddhist way of looking at things, by the way. Not like, you know, some core text, an Atman, right? That is permanent and then goes, no, but it's always this level of conditionality, anicca, and a kind of anicca and impermanence. Things are coming together, and there's a kind of movement within the tradition, and I think that's you know, part of the Buddhist genius. Okay, I can't see what I said here. Right. So one very important point is that there's not one game within the play of formulas. There are actually different types. In my understanding, each Bhāṇaka tradition, each Nikaya, each section of the long or middle or connected or numbered Anguttara discourses is a different game, a different kind of play of formulas. And the book works more with the longer text and the more narrative text, but there are different methods with the Samyutta Nikaya. These are things I'm working on now and writing these very days. Okay. So this is the answer to how the texts were composed. There were different games that I call the play of formulas, and then so there's, you know, I guess this is all I can give today at this level, is that, you know, there are these fixed elements. They can be repeated. They can also be taken apart and moved like it's a copy paste method that produces more and more texts, because the idea is not to go back to the Buddha to record, but to explore the possibilities embedded within the Dharma, to investigate the meaning, to look deeper, to experience, to give a narrative expression to a deep philosophical principle, to connect a story to a philosophy, and to keep working and creating and understanding life according to Dharma and Dharma according to life. Okay. So I thought it would be appropriate to say where I think this kind of understanding is taking us. And Trent, I guess we have 10. Do I have 10 minutes, or should I be
absolutely wrapping? No.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Please go for it.
Okay, great. So I thought it would be nice, because I figure people probably are interested in meditation and philosophy and want to know something about it. So this is kind of where this is not work I have really completed yet. Is ideas that are kind of appear in a kind of preliminary form in the book and in certain other places, but where I may be going with these with these understandings. Again, I got to try to move. Okay, let me do this. Okay, I don't quite see. All right, so does this say that early Buddhist vipassana, is that what it's?
Yeah, it says early vipassana, interweaving formulas and meditation. That's what we see.
Great, thanks. Right, so my idea again, basically, is that some of the formulas, the more doctrinal formulas, are guides for meditation, very specific guides for meditation, that it wouldn't be too difficult to learn by heart. I've done some of this and practiced this for a while. It's incredibly instructive and really helps you kind of get into the tradition, kind of learning these passages by heart. So any monk who's like serious about his practice could do this. And then say what we're going to look at is, say I want to look at the senses or the aggregates, right? The 5 aggregates, which are a very important scheme or conceptual scheme for analyzing the individual or analyzing experience, right? The body, sensations, perceptions, karmic dispositions, consciousness. And there are different formulas that tell us how we should look at the aggregates, or I'll be focusing more on the senses, on the eye. How do we look at the eye and the perceptual objects? And then, so there's all these different formulas, and basically the idea is this is what you meditate on. And this would be early Buddhist vipassana. Vipassana meaning analytical meditation, and meditation what do we mean by analytical? We say that term without thinking. It means that I'm taking this moment of experience and kind of looking into it and kind of trying to delve deep into it and see what it's composed of. And the very fact that it's composed of things breaks it up breaks the illusion kind of, and shows us that like it's anicca, that it's impermanent, and it's not to be, it shouldn't be, we shouldn't attract to it. We shouldn't grasp at it. Okay. So this is like basic example. Okay. This is the teaching of selflessness applied to the I. And I didn't give you the Pali here because I figured, most of you would probably be more comfortable with English. I can quote for you in Pali. Chakum bhikkave anityam, yad anityam tam dukkam, yam dukkam tadanatta, yadanatta netam mama nesoham asmi nam neso attati. Okay, the I, then this would connect to the formula could go on. The I is impermanent. That which is impermanent is suffering. That which is suffering should not be regarded truthfully with correct wisdom. Thus, I didn't recite that part. This is not mine. This is not I. This is not myself. Okay. Pretty short and concise, very, very deep. Okay, so we look at the eye, we can then continue. We would continue to look at the other senses, but also at the objects, the perceptual objects of each sense, and also the consciousness attached to each sense, and also any, they speak about the contact, the meeting of the eye, the object, the consciousness, and any feeling, any vedana that would arise dependent on that perceptual moment. Anything like that is to be looked at and seen as impermanent. If it's impermanent, it's painful. And if it's pain, it shouldn't be seen as myself or I or mine. So if you haven't gotten enlightened just from this short exposition, maybe try another formula. Okay, we could be applying the same formula, first of all, to the aggregates. Okay, this is the play of formulas. Now we have this one same formula. We'll have this. This is actually quoted from a specific text from Samyutta Nikaya, but I could give you the same text exactly applied to the aggregates or to other schemes. Okay, say for example the dhatus, the elements, right? Of earth and water and air and fire and and space. Okay. But we could also continue focusing on the I. That's what we're going to try to do for a minute. And you take another formula, which would say one should not conceive oneself as the I. This would be na chakum manyati, not chakum manyati. Okay, so manyati means think, but it means conceive oneself here. Okay, as in the I, chakusmin manyati, as apart from the I, chakuto manyati, as the I is mine. Chakume, na manyati. Okay. So this would be another pretty similar method of practice. We're still in the context of selflessness, and selflessness is actually not a teaching in a sense, but it's a sequence of such formulas. And normally they're applied to the aggregates, but the senses and the aggregates are pretty similar in the way they're treated. They're both these schemes that these formulas are applied to again and again. So we could meditate using one formula, and then we could meditate the next day or later that day using this formula, and it will help the mind kind of zoom in on the understanding, realizes the teaching in a deeper way. Or maybe we'll next day, we've had enough of selflessness, and now we'll take the teaching on conditionality. Chakum charu pecha upajati chakuvinyana. Based on the I and forms are the objects of the I consciousness arises. Tinam sangati passo. The meeting of the three is contact. Passapachaya vedana. Dependent on contact, feelings arise. Now, this is a very, this seems like nothing, but the text can just quote this and say, seeing this in this way, and then go through the whole liberation formula. Because the very understanding of conditionality, which is in Buddhist understanding, the characterization of anything that exists. But let's take perceptual objects or moments of experiences, always an assemblage of conditions, and that means they're like not real in a thick sense. They're not like strong facts. They're not reality. They're just conditioning. And then if you understand that, supposedly, you can just let go. So this would be something, and then you could continue, okay? Because this is actually, because once you get dependent on contact feelings, you can continue with depending on feelings, tanha, vedana pachaya, tanha, you'll get desire. And after tanha, desire, you'll get upadana, attachment. And then you can, so then the formulas just connect to each other quite naturally. It's a web. The teachings are like a web. You can navigate it. It's kind of like an underground, like we're like some kind of underground animal, a mole, do we say? And it just kind of digging in and connecting to the different teachings, or like weeds connected to each other in some kind of web. Okay, we could further connect to a meditative context. Okay, we've been observing the I. This has been a vipassana meditation. In my terms, okay, I think that this is a way to characterize early vipassana. These analytical schemes are, they're also a text, but they're also a practice. And I don't think all the monks are doing this, but I think, some of them may have been doing this. And some of them may have been also, you don't have to do everything. It's like, you can go anywhere along the web. The Dharma is like this web. You can go here or there. You can go tell a story. You can go do a meditation. You can go talk philosophy with your friends. And it does connect, though, also in the idealized way to these modes of samadhi. And one way that I mean, this is kind of my interpretation of this passage and ones like it, and the way the senses are approached. So the Buddha will say the eye should be abandoned, form should be abandoned, eye consciousness should be abandoned, eye contact should be abandoned. Any feeling that arises depending on eye contact, whether pleasant, painful, or neither pleasant nor painful, right? Sukham va, dukkham va, adukkam sukham va, it all pajahatabam should be pahatabam, sorry, all should be abandoned. This would presumably lead you into some kind of samadhi state, okay? And then we could, with this, keep going in this method of not taking pleasure in any of the senses, okay? Okay, so again, I'm just kind of saying that this mode of formulas is, I was talking today mainly about what the texts are, but the texts are not a reality of their own. And they relate to other types of Buddhist practice. And the Dharma is also this kind of formulaic method. We don't have to meditate about it, but the way Sila connects to Samadhi and Panya, and then we still have to go eat and take care of, our bodily needs and whatever, and we talk to people, and there's all these elements that are kind of interconnected all the time. So, so I'm kind of wrapping up, okay? So we've seen the texts from which these passages were quoted, all these, and then each one of these passages I quoted, I could quote it from 10 texts or maybe 100 or maybe more. I mean, these formulas, they're all over the place. And they're not historical reports about something a monk did or the Buddha said. They're idealized pictures, or at times, they're idealized pictures. In this case, they're formulaic images of practice, of truth, of history. And the text, what they're doing is they're exploring the Dhamma, exploring the teachings. They're conceptualizing it and verbalizing it. They're creating within the world of the Dharma. They're investigating its depths and potentials. Doctrine and philosophy and teachings, they naturally connect to narrative, to devotion, to different kinds of feelings. The text very elegantly and naturally move between these modes spontaneously. We never get just pure philosophy, don't get just a story. They're always kind of interwoven between each other. And the dynamic, as I was saying earlier, is maybe a truer reflection of the Dharma at its earlier stages than the facts that the text pretend to convey. This is like the lesson. And as I was saying, the formulas themselves reveal the ideals of early Buddhism, as I understand it. A very important ideal here is that of solitude. And this is just like one last formula. What would be the experience of knowing that we're not going to be reborn? This is a really seriously important ideal in early Buddhism, which actually suggests that there's like some, so say when someone knows that he's like liberated and birth is destroyed, kina jati, usitam brahmacharyam, katam karaniyam, na paramitattayati, you're not going to be reborn again, or other formulas, resonant formulas. What is that experience? And I think that would kind of be more, I mean, maybe the model is that vipassana actually leads to samatha in the early tradition. But that's just, it's still a guess at the moment, but it's kind of where these ideas are kind of moving towards, I think, because I think that there is a very important experience of quiet that the tradition cherishes. Okay. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Shulman, for such an energetic lecture, both in its oral and its written components. And I, for one, am really looking forward to this period of question and answer with you. And I know that many of you here today will have questions. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, if you'd like to ask a question, please send a chat message with your question to KF Q&A. The KF team will then relay selected questions for me so I can pose them directly to Professor Shulman. And as always, there are many of us here today. Our time is short, so I apologize in advance that we won't be able to get to every question. I'd like to begin with one here that's been expressed in a few different ways by questioners writing in their thoughts so far. And that is if I can ask you to talk about a couple of lists that some audience members are curious about their relationship to this idea of the play of formulas you've raised. So some audience members have mentioned this idea of the four dharma seals, which doesn't happen in the Pali tradition, but the idea that there are certain characteristics of the dharma, that everything is impermanent, that things are marked by suffering, by emptiness, or by a lack of self, that nirvana is peaceful. Others have mentioned this teaching in the Sanskritic tradition, this idea of the Chatvari Pratisharanani, the four reliances upon which one can rely on a particular Buddhist teaching or judge it to be authentic or not. And then in the Pali tradition, this is something, if I recall, you mentioned in your work, a particular sutta in the Anguttara Nikaya, the Mahapadesa Sutta, again mentions these four, one could say, great references in making a discernment about what is or is not the dharma. And I think to put into context what's at stake for many audience members is the idea of the play of formulas and articulating the early discourses being constructed in this way is destabilizing from the perspective of those who see the discourse as the fundamental unit of Buddhist teaching. So how do you see the argument you're making around the centrality of these formulas and the way they can be recombined as related to these other kinds of Buddhist frameworks around what is or is not the dharma? I hope that question makes sense.
Yeah, a kind of formulaic question with different elements, right?
Yes.
Okay, thanks very much for that. The easy part is the first, okay? So the characteristics of existence, right? So nirvana is peace. I think, I don't know, can't say this with authority, but it's more a Mahayana formulation. And in the Pali tradition, what we usually get is the tilakkhana, the three characteristics of anicca, dukkha, anatta, and anatta. Now they're all over the place, and actually they're one of the most serious formulas, which is very important for understanding the teaching. Usually it will come when the Buddha will ask someone, is, say, the I, right? I was going to quote this. Is the I permanent or impermanent? Chakkum bhikkhave nityam va anityam va. Okay? They'll say anityam bante. Of course, it's anicca. Yampana anityam dukkham va tam sukham va. What is anicca? Is it dukkha or is it sukha? It's dukkha. Dukkham bante. Yampana anityam dukkham viparinamantam viparinamadamam kalanuko tam samanupasati etamama esohamasmi esome attati. Is it fit? Is that which is anicca and dukkha and anatta? Is it fit to be regarded? This is mine. I am this. This is myself. And see, the thing about this formula, it's actually a really good example, because in certain cases, it's a very important philosophical exposition. say Rahula, the Buddha's son. This is like how he gets liberated when the Buddha exactly shows him to applies this to the eye, to the senses, and then to any experiences based on the senses. And it happens in so many places. But in other places, it's kind of used as I'd call it a kind of philosophical filler. The point is more about the narrative. And you just need a kind of, in the genre, the Buddha's got to teach something, so you just stick it in there. Or if you look at certain collections, always number 10 will be, take number 9 and replace the formula and put this one, because that's how we like to close. Because the 3 characteristics, they're really what, the Buddha, what we know the Buddha taught. And so they become a narrative element. And this is true also about different, like say, if you, this is like the lists of 9 meditative states, the 4 jhanas, the 4 formless samapatis, nirodha, cessation. Like take the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, the story of the Buddha's death. They tell us that the Buddha, when he was dying, he went through the 9 states, backward also back to the first, then back to the 4th, and then he died. Now, how do they know that? Even the text says, he didn't say anything. Okay, so maybe because these are arahants, they know other people's minds. We could maybe argue that. But nevertheless, you would kind of say they took a certain authorial liberty to use the image of these very important meditative states as a kind of characterization of consciousness in order to speak about this dramatic moment of the Buddha's death, and in order to verify the importance of this meditative scheme, which is also something that probably develops with time within the teaching, because there's lots of different samadhis that eventually made their way into these kind of fixed ways. And sometimes when we read the text, we can see the earlier kind of layers, the more original formulation. So, okay, so I hope that answers. These ideas are there, okay? And about like the Mahapadesas and the other
is the 4 reliances, these Jatuparisharana in the Sanskrit tradition.
But that's I mean because rely on the meaning, not on the words, that stuff, right? Right. Yep. So I mean, okay, that it's actually, kind of proves my point in a way, but it'd be too easy an argument for me to make because it's not really part of the early tradition. But generally, yes, I think there's something of that spirit in the tradition, right? That cares about the Dharma, doesn't care about the facts. Not that the facts are not important, but they're not as important. And for the Mahapadesas, that's a kind of, the question is, what is the tradition saying when, see the point is that some new monk will say, okay, I heard this from the Buddha or from someone else, and we'll want to check if he's serious or not. So then we'll have to compare it to the Dharma that we know or that we've accepted. And I think that the comparison would have to work with these kind of fixed utterances on a certain level. Theoretically, it could be a question of spirit. That's like, fine, that's easy to deal with. But I actually think, and I deal with this in the book, and I can't say, read it, maybe you'll become convinced. That's one place where I'm not 100% convinced by my own kind of reasoning. I still feel there's more to be explored there, and in some of these kind of major statements of the tradition. But basically, the idea is that a certain formulation would be memorized and compared to what other people memorize, and that the fixed sequences of words are of importance. And that's basically what this doctrine is kind of trying to evoke.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I'd like to ask a related question now that's coming in from, again, a couple of different attendees. And here I'm perhaps asking you to step back a little bit and describe, for those who are maybe not as familiar with some of the work you're arguing against, what the recent advances in the study of early Buddhist texts has meant, particularly the comparative studies with Chinese parallels to early collections of Buddhist discourses, the Sanskrit Dirghagama portions, the Gandhari manuscripts, etc. And part of what I'm hearing in the questions submitted is to take, for instance, the example of something like the Satipatthana Sutta that has parallels sort of within the Pali tradition in different kinds of formulas, as you mentioned, as well as a discourse that has parallels in other traditions. How would you, first of all, describe how someone like Bhikkhu Analayo approaches the study of that, given the new advances in the comparative study of early Buddhist texts? And how does your view of studying a discourse like that differ? Does that question make sense? Sorry, there's kind of two parts of it, but
Yeah,
I think
pretty
it'd
much.
just be helpful to fill out a little more context for the audience.
Sure. Okay. So take the Satipatthana. I don't remember how many versions we have of it. I think there are 2 Chinese versions, if I'm not mistaken. But potentially, I mean, if you take Analayo is an incredible scholar. He's written, more than all of us in Buddhist studies, in the past 20 years. And he really believes in this comparative work. Why does he believe in it? Because he thinks there's an origin out there. I mean, of course there is to some degree, right? The Buddha must have been, I mean, I'm not the kind of scholar who thinks, who doubts the existence of the Buddha, like, some scholars like to say. I don't know if the Buddha is what we think he was, that's another question. So then he gave teachings, right? Are the texts the records of these teachings for a guy like Analayo? Yes, this is what tradition is trying to do, is trying to preserve, to keep the words of the Buddha and to record the life events of the Buddha, okay? And then, how are we going to know what those first words were? We're going to take all the available versions that we have, compare them to each other, and see what makes better sense. Certain elements we could assume were introduced. Say, if they're like, there's the question of what's like kind of the influence of more devotional elements. Scholars like to say that comes later, which is kind of assuming what you want to prove, but that's, and that's always the issue with these. It always comes up. But so we have different versions, we'll compare them, we'll see where they agree, and when they differ, we'll see which version makes better sense, and we'll take that as a kind of, as close as we can get to the original, okay? My argument, and then this has been practiced for a long time, and there especially was a real big boom in Buddhist studies about like, about in the early 2000s, when all these texts were coming up from Gandhara. And there we had, real texts from 2,000 years ago. That's not that far from the Buddha. And so it's a different language where they're not, they don't understand Gandhara like we understand Pali or Sanskrit or even Chinese, but nevertheless, these are texts that can be read and compared to the other texts. And then we have a version, because say we're reading, the text I'm reading are very late editions, 18th, 19th, 20th century, so here this takes us really close to the Buddha. So scholars were like really optimistic, we have like a strong verification for what the early tradition might have been like. And what Richard Solomon said to me not that long ago, he's like the main guy, number one person doing this Gandhari stuff. He said, we've been going down a dead end. He was very happy about this kind of approach that I'm advocating, because the texts don't compare all that well. Now, let me just kind of be my own devil's advocate for a minute, okay? When I read an Aleo's work and I see where the texts agree, I learn a lot. Because you see that there, in many cases, there is some kind of text there. There is some kind of grid or an agreement, and that's an important fact in itself. And of course, the early Buddhists also wanted to preserve the tradition. I'm not denying that in any way. I'm just saying that that kind of approach, this kind of more kind of linear and kind of essentialist or historicist approach, has dominated the study of Buddhism. And that's not what people do with texts, certainly not religious texts, where they really, really care about things. So they want the story to be good. They don't only want it. It's like, people aren't reporters. They're not, it's not the news. And even the news isn't the news, as we know, right? So people are telling stories. That's what they do. And if they weren't telling good stories, we wouldn't be here talking about the Buddha. That's what gets people going. And then, so my argument here is two things. First, there is no core in a strong sense that each discourse is like a moment. Some discourses may be that or may contain that, not be that, but they may contain that, but most of them don't, like the vast majority don't. And that's an essentialist assumption I think is mistaken. And it's a cognitive model that is wrong for the tradition. It's wrong for most traditions, but it's especially wrong for Buddhism. It's like reading the Gospels and trying to figure out what really happened in Jesus' life. You give that up after a while. And then the other problem is that each version, each text we do find, the fact that the texts don't compare all that well is no less important than that they do compare. Because the tradition seems to have cherished the expressivity, cherished the personal reworking of the Dharma, been really interested in some monk, mastering the tradition and telling us how he understood it, and giving us his Satipatthana or his Mahaparinibbana or his any text. And then why compare the different versions, which are kind of, those are not necessarily performances. They may be performances in some cases. There may be literary versions. They may be philosophical, scholarly syntheses. They may be kind of, works of joint recitation. They can be lots of things. I don't think there's one answer to what they are. What I want to open up is the option for plurality, for multiplicity. I think it's true not only about the text, is true about the meditation, it's true about the philosophy, it's even true about liberation. There's lots of different understandings that were very important.
Thank you. I think that's a wonderful place for us to end here this evening. I know there are more questions, many more things that I'd love to be able to ask you and engage you on. But I think this is the time we have, and the way you summed up the core of your argument just now, I thought was especially cogent and evocative for all of us here. So we, if everyone here could join me in thanking you again for your fantastic lecture and for your engaging response to our questions. I feel really fortunate that we had this chance to spend this time with you today, Professor Shulman.
Thanks so much. It's really wonderful speaking to you all. And thanks again for the opportunity, and to the Kenza Foundation, and to you, Trent. And I hope to see you all soon.
Thank you again. So before we end, I just wanted to draw your all attention to the next talk in the series by Dr. Naomi Appleton of the University of Edinburgh. She'll be speaking on narrative Buddhology, explorations of Indian Buddhist literature. Her talk will take place on Saturday, March 19th of 2022. And if you're on the Kensei Foundation mailing list, you'll receive more info about Dr. Appleton's lecture in early March. And as you may know from looking at the schedule, we'll soon have talks from Venerable Professor K.L. Dhammajoti of the Buddha Dharma Center of Hong Kong. That particular lecture will be in Chinese. We'll also have a lecture in May from Professor Jens-Uwe Hartmann of Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. And as always, visit kenseifoundation.org/events and also kenseifoundation.org/the Goodman lectures for more info as the lecture series will continue throughout 2022. So thank you all again for joining us. We hope to see you again soon. May you all be safe and well.